Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia. I'm 47 years old, and this is one of the most unbelievable stories I've ever experienced. Even now, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it, but I can't stop replaying the events in my mind.
I've told this story before, but it's one I enjoy sharing because, well, screw Tammy. Tammy was my boss at the time. One evening, while working late on stock inventory, we were discussing the upcoming lunar eclipse. Someone asked how an eclipse works, and Tammy, in her infinite wisdom, confidently explained that it happens when America moves in front of the moon, blocking it from Australia's view. She genuinely believed the Earth stretched itself into a U-shape or neck pillow form, with half of it staying in orbit, and the other half somehow bending over to block the moon for everyone else. One of my roommates. I live in a house where we interview potential new roommates to make sure they'll fit in. We were once interviewing a deaf guy who seemed like a great match. We also have a set of rules and guidelines for living in the house. During the interview, one of the current roommates asked, "Oh man, are we going to need to print the rules in Braille?" For to a deaf guy. Sadly, this was far from an isolated example of his cluelessness. Let's call him Chad. Chad was someone I worked with years ago, and he was completely hopeless with directions. He never knew where he was, how to get anywhere, or how to recognize landmarks. One day, we were working less than 5 minutes from our store in a small residential neighborhood about 1.5 miles away. To get back to the store, you just had to make 3 right turns and cross one intersection. Realizing we'd forgotten some equipment at the store, I asked Chad to go grab it. He looked confused, so I explained the route. He still seemed unsure, so I drew him a map. Off he went. 25 minutes later, Chad hadn't returned. I called the store and learned he'd left 10 minutes earlier. While still on the phone, I heard the truck approaching, but he drove right past the house. No problem. The road was a loop, so I waited. A moment later, he came back around. I waved him down, and he finally pulled into the driveway. Laughing, I said, "You forgot which house we were at, didn't you?" Chad, dead serious, replied, "Nah, you moved the truck." He'd been looking for the company truck, completely forgetting he was driving it. During my younger and more irritable days, I worked with a young woman who was, without question, the most clueless person I've ever met. Some highlights include her winning a basket auction containing Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, only to complain because she didn't want to hear a bunch of mooing. On a particularly frustrating day, I convinced her to wait to open her Coke bottle because it claimed there was a winner every 5 minutes. She was genuinely disappointed when she didn't win after waiting exactly 5 minutes, but I enjoyed her sulky silence afterward. The best, or worst, incident was when she was chatting with an African-American manager. She's white. They discovered they both had slightly unusual names and family connections to South Carolina. After thinking for a moment, she proudly exclaimed, "I bet my family owned yours." She beamed, so pleased with herself for making the connection, while the manager silently walked away without a word. My friend's sister, who was 20 and pregnant at the time, mentioned how upset she was about the possibility of her vagina being ruined. Jokingly, I replied, "Maybe the baby will come out of your butt instead." She looked at me and asked, "Wait, what do you mean? Can they come out that way too?" Thinking she was joking, I sarcastically said, "Of course it's a 50-50 chance." She believed me and ended up asking her doctor if he could determine whether the baby would come out of her vagina or her butt. My mom has a coworker who claims she doesn't care about gas prices. She always says, "It doesn't matter how much it costs because I only ever put in 20 bucks. I work with a guy who genuinely believes he will never die. He also insists that doctors are part of the system and only lie to people for money and personal gain. However, he fully trusts Eastern traditional medicine. If you're curious about his secret to eternal life, it's eating 6 raw eggs every day and following a keto diet. During my time in the Navy, there was a cook on my ship who once served rare chicken. I honestly couldn't decide if he was trying to cover up his complete lack of skill or if he truly believed rare chicken was a real thing. Given how clueless he was, I wouldn't be surprised if it were the latter. On another occasion, he filled a pan with ground beef and called it meatloaf. Then there was the time he was supposed to bake sugar cookies for the entire crew. Hundreds of them. He didn't bother reading the label on the container he grabbed or tasting the batter, and he ended up making salt cookies. He used up every bit of salt in the pantry, so we had completely bland food for the remaining weeks of the mission. After that, the captain assigned someone to act as his bodyguard. I'm half Korean and went to high school in the Midwest during the 1992 LA riots. One day, my typing teacher pulled me into the hallway and asked if I had an uncle or someone in LA that I could call to stop the riots. She explained that she knew we were all close-knit and had stores and everything, so surely I must have some connection there. I just stared at her and said, "Even if I did have an uncle I could call, do you think he's Batman?" I can summarize this story easily. We were at the shooting range, his gun jammed, and he looked straight down the barrel to figure out what was wrong. I had a manager named Roxanne, or Rocky. She was a bleach blonde airhead who bleached her hair monthly and couldn't understand why it kept breaking and falling out. The only reason she had the job was because her dad owned the restaurant. Rocky was obsessed with her appearance and not much else. One day, she told me and a coworker that she'd gotten a nose job so her future children wouldn't inherit her original nose. She was completely serious. My coworker and I just looked at each other and walked away, knowing it wasn't worth responding. My roommate of 3 years once said that if solar technology keeps improving at its current rate, we'll eventually absorb all of the sun's energy and solve global warming. Not even 5 minutes later, after I tried to explain that the sun's energy output isn't affected by how it's used, he declared that wind farms are worse because they cause tropical storms. I really hope he was trolling, but honestly, I have no idea. A coworker of mine was strongly against windmills. When I asked why, she said, "There are just too many of them being built and we're going to use up all the wind." I was completely speechless. That never happens to me. I used to work with a French-Italian guy, and I could probably write an entire book about how absurd, illogical, and clueless he was. But this story captures it perfectly. He was against vaccinations because he believed everything in the world was part of some massive government conspiracy. On top of that, he was a nature fanatic who swore by homeopathy. He believed clay possessed nearly magical healing properties. While living in Denmark, he and his wife had to get their son vaccinated to enroll him in kindergarten, as required by law. So, they took the boy to get the shots. However, as soon as they left the doctor's office, he removed the bandage and slapped a lump of clay onto the injection site on his son's arm. He genuinely thought the clay would draw the vaccine liquid out of his son's veins and absorb it, effectively unvaccinating him. In his mind, he had outsmarted the system, and the clueless government had no idea. Take that, New World Order. Ironically, thanks to his ridiculous plan, the boy ended up with the vaccinations he needed, despite having such a delusional father. Why do crosswalk signals make beeping sounds? They're for blind people. But blind people can't drive. My brother and I were teenagers in the kitchen one day. He was filling the sink to do the dishes. When it was nearly full, he went to turn off the faucet, but the handle wouldn't budge, so the water kept flowing. I tried to shut it off too, but it wouldn't move. That's when we started panicking. The water level was rising quickly, and we were desperate to avoid flooding the kitchen. My brother grabbed some large saucepans from the cupboard to collect the water, while I frantically searched under the sink to find the main valve to shut it off there. But I couldn't locate it. Now, in full panic mode, I took over the task of filling the pots, and my brother sprinted off to find Dad. He came running back with Dad while we were yelling about shutting off the mains. Dad walked calmly to the sink and simply pulled the plug out of the drain, letting all the water flow out. Ha ha. I once had a property manager who oversaw the rental we lived in because the homeowners lived out of state. She was incredibly obnoxious and did plenty of sketchy things. My husband and I suspected she was pocketing money or keeping it hidden from the homeowners, especially when it came to repairs, because her actions often seemed shady. One time we were talking about gardening, and she said, "You know, I've always wanted to grow tomatoes and water them with salt water. That way, the tomatoes would already be salted when you ate them." It was a great reminder that sometimes it's not malicious intent, it's just sheer old-fashioned stupidity.